and welcome back to my channel. My name is Bree Buonomo. Hi if you're new here, or hey if you've been here before. And today is my monthly wrap up for April. I know this is coming out a little bit later and we may or may not be halfway into May already, but I wanted to provide the updates in case you weren't following along with my vlogs. But if you're new here, this is the time when I just kind of recap my life in the previous month, which includes the books I read, the things I wrote, and usually some personal life tidbits. So without me getting off into many tangents, let's just jump right into the books I read in the month of April. So in the month of April, I counted 8 books that I read and finished. And I'm gonna start with the one that is kind of like the throwaway here, and that would be the Encyclopedia of Counseling. So this was the book that I have been using as my study guide for my exam for my NCE. I'll talk about that later in the video. But the Encyclopedia of Counseling is essentially like the study guide for your national counseling exam. And I had been studying that since probably last June, I think, maybe even before that. I started studying it with my friend before she was taking her test. And then she took her test in August and then gave it to me. So I had been meandering my way through it for a long time. But in the months of March and April, it really started going gung-ho. And it's a study prep guide. However, I pretty much read that entire thing from cover to almost cover, except for like the index. And I'm counting it towards my reading goal because I spent a huge part of this year so far reading that. It's not going to be necessarily useful for you unless you are also trying to take your NCE in the future, in which case then I recommend it. The questions on the exam are not necessarily like the book, but it is a really good prep to re-engage and remind you of all the things you've learned in your counseling program. With that said, I then actually finished in the month of April Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Chanel Miller was the victim of Brock Turner, who was sexually assaulted and had a very public case in California that also ended up leading to a ton of changes in state and federal legislature, which is amazing. But I read her story and just kind of following her process and being the victim who was initially unnamed and how that all played with her identity and then choosing to later come forward as the identified victim. And it was just very powerful. It's nonfiction, obviously, and it details a lot of information that is pretty graphic because of the content of the memoir, but I would highly recommend it if you're able to. It was definitely life-changing for me and I'm really glad that I read it. Next, I read and finished A Long Stretch of Bad Days by Mindy McGinnis. Mindy McGinnis is one of my favorite authors and I talk about her all the time on here. This book follows 2 girls in a small Ohio town and how their like Appalachian lifestyle as well as the culture of a small rural town can play into lives. And this in particular follows 2 girls who kind of have different opposite lives. Like one is looked at as like prestigious and like that she should have money because her dad is a lawyer, but her dad actually defends criminals and that makes them kind of a very polarizing family. Whereas the other girl is in a lower class family and is very much known as like the town trash and like has lots of rumors about her and all that. And they end up teaming up to try to get their grades up in order to get into a college or, you know, moving, at least graduating and moving forward with their future. And the main girl, Lydia, has a podcast. So Lydia asks Bristol, the other girl, to team up with her. And as they initially start this podcast to kind of dish a little bit about their town, they end up starting to uncover a bunch of secrets about their town that leads to an unsolved murder being discussed and brought to justice. And it's very good. This kind of has some thriller, some mystery, and as always, Mindy McGinnis really hits home on some really deep topics. In this case, like poor rural towns, it really kind of has an emphasis there in this one. And I loved it. I think if you read it or listen to the audiobook, you can't go wrong. And I would definitely recommend almost every single book of hers in some capacity to some people. So if this sounds up your alley, I definitely recommend it. I gave it 5 stars. Next, I continued in the Black Witch trilogy by Laurie Forrest, and I read Light Mage, which is the second prequel novella to the Black Witch. So this follows Sage Gaffney, and you kind of follow her throughout her childhood leading up till about the time she's 18 in this novella. And again, it's a novella, but it's about like 250 pages, I think. And it's a prequel, so it's following Sage as she becomes a possessor of the Great Wand of Power, and it's following her to what leads to her decision to give it to our main character in the series, Ellerin Gardner. It was a great installment. I would again recommend this book. I don't think you can go wrong with a single book in this series. And now the puppies have come. Hi, babies. Hello, I love you guys. I don't know if Suki's gonna leave me alone, so we're gonna have to power through. Next I read Healing as a Gift, which is a poetry collection by Alexandra Veselu. This was a pick for our book club in person, and nobody at book club liked it. The poems are very generic, they were very repetitive, and they oftentimes seemed almost condescending or preaching. We also, no shade to the author in any way, like it just wasn't my jam of poetry, but we did start kind of like a conspiracy at book club that this author might be actually an AI because we could find no information about this author other than she shares a name with some woman from Russia that had died in like the 40s or something like that. So yeah, it was just very interesting. And that conversation about the conspiracy we made was more engaging than we felt the poetry collection was. So it was a miss for us. Next, I read and finished In Abundance of Catherines by John Green. So this was actually the follow-up to Looking for Alaska. And Looking for Alaska is one of my favorite books of all time to this day. I love it. I don't care if you're not a John Green fan or not, but I just love that book. And this one I was really hoping for something good. And honestly, to date, this is the worst John Green book I've read. I was happy that it was short, and it just really wasn't that engaging. I thought I was expecting I was gonna have more from this story, and I just wasn't invested. It follows a boy named Colin who has dated like 19 Catherines and counting, as it says on the back. And he talks about trying to find like the formula of why he's like looking for Catherines and what they all have in common and why they all broke up with him. Granted, he's like 16. He's super smart, and that's why he's trying to solve like this equation of like, well, if I have this equation right, then the next Catherine I date is gonna be the one. And just kind of debunking that he needs this formula at all. I don't have much else to say. I just didn't really care for it. It was fine. I was able to finish it, but I would probably end up unhauling this, to be honest, because I don't think I'll ever read it again. And the next one was I'm the Girl by Courtney Summers. Courtney Summers wrote Sadie, which is one of my all-time favorite books, and my favorite book and audiobook of, I think it was 2019. I would highly recommend it. I really love her writing style, and I love how potent her messaging is. It follows a young woman who has a lot of trauma in her life, including the loss of her mother, poverty, and just the general perception that youth can skew in your mind, where she feels like her mother had been out to get her and didn't approve of her, and how that led her to at-risk behaviors. Basically, the main character, Georgia, feels like the only thing that she has going for her is her looks, and how when she tries to use them to her advantage, she ends up actually getting exploited. There are lots of heavy topics in this book, so be warned. There is child grooming, child trafficking, sexual assault, questions of sexuality, and how that can play and skew, again, your view of the world. So it was very heavy. I found myself kind of just like needing to sit and process it while I was reading. I think that the book handles it really well, and the implications of the book run much deeper. I know I saw a few critiques about how they felt like it wasn't anything necessarily at all, but I do think it handles it in a way that makes you understand that like at-risk youth can and will get swept into sexual assault and sexual trafficking and all these things because they don't understand the consequences when they're looking for approval and a validation. And with this particular girl in the novel, she lost her mother, her brother was struggling to keep them just above the poverty level and failing, and she had gone and tried to do something that she thought was going to help the family and ended up causing her to be more at risk. So I really liked it, but again, just cautionary tale of the trigger warnings. Be sure that if you're going to read it, you understand what is in the book. And those were the books that I read in the month. I almost included Apex magazine in here, but I realized that I still had like 1 or 2 stories left in the magazine. But I have been making a lot of progress and reading quite a lot lately, and that's been great. So those are all the books I read. Let me know what you think, if you've read any of them, or what was your favorite book of the month of April. So real quick, I just wanted to touch base about all my writing. So if you watched any of my vlogs, I definitely got back into Mermaid a little bit, and I actually had a 7K word day at the end of the month, which I was extremely happy about because it had been so long since I wrote in Mermaid and really just enjoyed and progressed the story. While I did not finish Mermaid in the month, I am almost done with the novel, so I feel really good about finishing that up in the month of May, and I'm hoping that we will finish and make progress, and maybe I can get the rest of the document to my critique partners and they can give me some feedback, so over the summer I can really dive in and make those edits and move it along. My Camp Nano goal was to write a poem every day so that in the end I have 30 poems. And I did write 30 poems. There were, I think, 3 days where I missed the day based on just mental health needs or issues that were going on in my life. But I made it up by doubling up a poem the next day. So I have 30 new poems that are all around the theme of anger and emotions, and I'm very proud of them. There are a couple that I have to tweak still. I didn't like wording. I needed to finish some of them. Like one poem, for instance, I had 3 stanzas and I only had 2 initially, and then I was like, I want to add a 3rd one. So I think I wrote like a note on what I wanted to write there, but I didn't finish it. So granted, like anything, right? These are first draft poems that I want to edit and maybe refine a little bit more before I do anything with them. And in the month, even though I didn't write a ton more in April, I have been brainstorming some short stories. I have gotten the submission bug lately, and there's a lot of magazines that have calls out that are up my alley, like things that I think I want to submit to. So there's 3 short stories that I want to write, and there's 2 short stories that I think I want to tweak. One is fully written and has been edited and has been workshopped in the past. The only thing with that one is that it might be too long for a lot of those magazines. So if I'm going to submit it, I probably need to trim it down. And I was trying to figure out like when I want to do that. The other short story has been written many, many years ago, and I think I'm going to pretty much scrap the main plot of that and make it into more of a sci-fi fantasy story instead, because the original story when I wrote it was a mental health focus. But unfortunately, I think with just how I wrote it in the past and thinking about the implications of mental health and my own role as a counselor, I don't think it will be appropriate anymore. I think it was a product of its times, but I think we learned so much more and mental health has gained so much more awareness that I think it would stigmatize mental health more, and I don't want to pursue that. So because I'm going to take the mental health element out, I think what I'm left with is a Rapunzel retelling that has to do more with monsters. And I'm excited to re-edit this and pretty much just write a new story. It's not going to be the old story, except for the fact that it's a Rapunzel theme. So I'm excited to get into those short stories. That is going to be one of my main goals, is to, once I finish Mermaid, I want to write and just focus on those short stories before I go back into edits for Mermaid. And lastly, I'm just going to touch base on some personal life tidbits. I had one major thing in April that was causing me tons and tons of anxiety and meant that like most things in my life were paused, and that was taking my national counseling exam, or the NCE. In the state of Pennsylvania, the NCE is required in order for me to apply for my license as a professional counselor. So these are kind of like each step you have to take to get licensed. This exam is a big part, and they have to basically test your knowledge on what you know as a counselor. And if you pass, then you can send those results to the state board along with all the other information they require, and eventually they'll say, okay, you got everything in, you can be licensed. So I took my test on April 24th, and it was extremely stressful, and I really, had a lot of stress. This is in my vlog, so you can go back and check it out. At this time, as this video is even probably going up, I still do not have my exam results. They take up to 8 weeks to come in, but I'm 95% sure I passed, and I went ahead and opened my license application with the state. Because it was going to take forever for the state to process things anyway, I'm like, we're just going to do it. They can start rolling and accepting things, and then hopefully by the time my exam results come in, that's like the last piece that needs to be accepted. Spoiler alert, I opened my exam about 2 weeks ago, and they have approved 2 things out of the 13 that's needed. It's gonna take a while. That was really the main thing. I did feel a little bit more at peace once my exam was done and I got to write more, but I really haven't had too many things going on in April because I was so focused on doing the exam. So I'm gonna change things up a little bit and just briefly just mention some of the things that I'm watching and or listening to. So as far as my most recent movies watched, I watched Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which is a Marvel movie with my husband. Personally, I really liked it. It wasn't like a masterpiece. I just enjoyed it and thought it was a good story. So I would recommend it. As far as TV shows go, we watched Shrinking. I think we finished Shrinking. I finished Daisy Jones and the Six. and we watched The Mandalorian, and all of those were great. As far as music goes, I've been listening to Melanie Martinez's new album. If you guys are listening to her as well, let me know what you think, but I am pretty obsessed with Void. I really like the beats to it, and I also like Milk of the Sirens. So those are I think they're my favorites so far, but I may end up liking others as I listen to the album on repeat. I've also been listening to the Taylor Swift backlog because I never really became a Swift fan until 1989 came out, and I am going to see her in concert. So I've been trying to listen to some of her older country music to prepare because I don't want to seem like I don't know what I'm doing there, because I know most of her music now. It's just not all of the songs from the past. And as far as games go, we know, if you guys pay attention to any of my vlogs at any point, I was a gamer at some point in my life, and then I kind of focused more hardcore on book writing. But in April, I did go back and I've been playing some Apex Legends, which is a first-person shooter. And the reason I started playing again in April is because they brought back for this season Gun Run, which is a form of a game called Gun Game in Call of Duty, where basically you have to try to work your way through all the guns. It's a very fast-paced game. It's very adrenaline-filled, and the goal is to get kills with all the weapons, and then, you know, the last one, which is a melee or a knife in this game, is the winner. So it was like, you know, as you go through. I used to be obsessed with Gun Game in college and Call of Duty when I used to play Call of Duty, and now that Apex has Gun Run, I just love it so much. So that's what I've been playing a lot in my off time, or when I need, like, you know, some mental breaks. So yeah, anyway, that is all of my updates for April. Nothing too crazy, but I feel like I'm in a better place going into May, and I'm excited to see what the month brings. So let me know how your April went. How did your Camp Nano go if you participated? What are you reading, watching, listening to? Give me any updates you want, and let me know if you have any goals for May. So that's all for me, and until next time, I'll see you then. Bye!